Hi, I'm Jim Bergeron, pastor at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Houston, Texas, and this is the sermon for Sunday, the 6th of August in 2023, Pentecost 10. In the early days of Roman civilization on the Italian peninsula, it was an idyllic time. Records show peaceful farm life on efficiently used private property. Towns were built to support peasant farmers with markets and meeting places. A typical family in the early republic owned several acres, and the whole family did their part in sowing and tilling, reaping and marketing. Crops were regularly rotated between grains and legumes to promote soil fertility. Fruits, vines, vegetables, and olive trees were cultivated. Sheep, swine, poultry, common. Communities grew surplus goods to share and sell, but they were subject to invasions from people who would rather steal food and crafted products instead of going through the work of growing, harvesting, and manufacturing. So, militias were formed to protect the food sources. Over time, militias grew into armies. War changed the agricultural world. At first, to be a soldier, you had to be a landowner. That way you had a dog in the fight. But many farmers died or were disabled in combat. Others were absent, fighting battles in distant lands. The land they worked, damaged by war or neglect. In the absence of men's labor, debt on property mounted, putting tremendous economic pressure on war widows and children. Productive farmsteads were liquidated at depression prices, and the people on them killed or sold as slaves. Aristocrats and senators became agricultural plutocrats who merged small acreage homesteads into huge plantations called latifundia. They converted calorie-rich cereal crops to grazing land, orchards, and vineyards, and manned them with slaves for free labor. Absentee landlords inspected their holdings occasionally, but never worked the land. By the end of the 3rd century BC, there was a debt-ridden tenant class. Was undermined and dying in the countryside, and in Rome, a propertyless, rootless, anarchic underclass, whose sullen discontent would eventually, in centuries, destroy the empire that peasant toil had built. In 189 BC, Rome boasted 1 million people in its metropolitan area. Circus Maximus and Flaminius were free to all free people, paid for by the state, and candidates for senatorial office. This precluded the poor from seeking office. Special interest groups and lobbyists eroded representative government. Roman society shifted from a community of fulfilled, happy, free laborers to a community of economics by plunder and slavery. Slaves did the work, so it was just as profitable to be idle as it was to toil. Why work a field all day for nothing when you could work a city dump for 200 calories an hour? Slaves were $1 a head, 10,000 sold in a day in some marketplaces. It was a wasteful and brutal system, supporting only 2% of the families that had once lived and thrived on the same acreage, while free persons. Several reformers tried to help. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus tried to enact legislation that would redistribute land to poorer citizens. Quoting from his greatest speech, recorded in Plutarch's Lives, "The beasts of the field and the birds of the air have their holes and their hiding places, but the men who fight and die for Italy, enjoy only the light and the air. Our generals urge their soldiers to fight for the graves of their ancestors. The appeal is idle and false. You fight and die to give wealth and luxury to others. You are called masters of the world, but there is not a foot of ground that you can call your own. You recognize parts of that quote from Matthew 8:20 and Luke 9:58, where Jesus in the late 20s AD said, "The foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." This is clear evidence that Jesus was well versed in the classics of his day. Quoting from a speech made by Tiberius Gracchus 150 years earlier, sets a context of deep antipathy toward the Roman government. While we can't imagine the hatred and the betrayal of the citizenry, we can connect the dots. The Senate killed Tiberius Gracchus. His brother Caius assumed leadership. He tried a more balanced legislative approach with some benefits for peasants. He developed some new colonies, suburbs, and shopping mall trade centers for the middle class. He passed a bill that soldiers be clothed at the public expense, and he gained the gratitude of the urban masses by passing the Lex Frumentaria, the corn dole, which committed the government to distribute corn for anyone who could prove their citizenship. Entitlements were funded by higher taxes, which made the economy worse. Vested interests prevailed. Caius was killed and decapitated. Septimulius filled his skull cavity with molten lead to collect the reward of the weight of his head in gold, an incentive promised by the Roman Senate, an official body. He laughed all the way to the bank with 17 pounds of gold, and farmers continued to be liquidated to supply the vicious Roman monster. Food or revolution? That's a choice. Pliny said, Latifundia perdidere Italiam, which translates, the plantations have ruined Italy. There were cattle ranches wider than kingdoms, tended by chained slaves. Pliny mentions an estate with 4,117 slaves, 7,200 oxen, 250,000 other livestock. Corporate farming took over. During the time of Jesus, Rome produced and drank 25 million gallons of wine annually. That's 2 quarts a week for every man, woman, and child, slave or free. The empire was so widespread that Rome had to train locals to be their soldiers. A Jewish farmer in occupied territory had 4 choices: die by the sword, be bought out for pennies on the dollar and move to the city, become a slave or starve to death, or become a drafted soldier of the empire with the possibility of citizenship. While the latter was the best deal. Uniform, food, training to quell all those mutinous little revolutions that are popping up in the backwoods. It's a prescription for disaster. Take one small, overrun country at the antipodes of a rotten empire. Drop it in a seething cauldron of political corruption, which is not just a swamp, it is a sewer of failing social welfare systems, a swelling slum urbanization of former productive farm families, marginalize a 4,000-year religious tradition, kill without mercy by crucifixion anyone who talks out of line, and watch your back. Because you've just created the best conditions for insurgency of a lethal variety. And this is the world of Jesus and the social context for the Jesus movement / revolution. Food or revolution? Calories or war? Outside of the resurrection, the most significant miraculous event reported in the Bible is the feeding of large crowds by Jesus. The feeding of multitudes with loaves and fishes is the only narrative to be found in all 4 gospel renditions. It is axiomatic that anything repeated in the scriptures is doubled in importance. The more repetition, the more exponential the emphasis. For example, the Gentile conversion of Cornelius and his baptism by Peter is recounted 3 times. Very important. This emphasis is surpassed by the repetition of the conversion of Saul on the road to Damascus, a 4-time told tale. And we can agree that Peter and Paul are 2 of the heavyweight heroes of the new Jesus movement in the New Testament. And they stand in only the penumbra, the shadow of the weight and significance of the miracle of the loaves and fishes, the feeding of the thousands. Nothing else, other than a crucifixion and resurrection, come near the importance of this account. It's in 6, count them, 6 places in 4 Gospels. Mark 6, Mark 8, Matthew 14, Matthew 15, Luke 9, and John 6. The first big feed comes on the heels of the assassination of the only other probable contender for a revolutionary leader of the Jews against Rome, John the Baptizer. He is seen as a martyr, a human sacrifice that will spearhead the revolution, a rallying cry, a signal that it has begun. It is time. Remember the baptizer. Remember the announcer, the herald, John, the forerunner of the Messiah. Beheaded. Silver platter? Does the name Caius Gracchus ring a bell? The crowd that follows Jesus into the wilderness, the unclean place where you don't eat, is not out there looking for words of wisdom and consolation. They're not out there for a happy little church picnic. They have been counted. The census has been made. Anytime there's counting in the Bible, the killing is about to commence. You count able-bodied troops in preparation for war. The fighting men are counted in numbers of variously 5 and 4,000. Women and children not counted, but fed. We can assume the actual number fed in the range of 10 to 12,000 people. Imagine that. 5,000 terrorist insurgents in one place, many very dangerously trained by the legions of Rome. 2,000 years after the fact, research has listed at least 29 political parties and sectarian affiliations. The list is too long to read in a sermon, and is included in the written transcript of this communication. You'd recognize scribes, Pharisees, priests, Levites, names like that. There were many others. Some were enraged farmers with pitchforks. Others, mercenaries who killed for the fun of it and plundering paycheck perks. None were united, all volatile sectarians, all hungry from a day's march, simmering in the late spring heat. And Jesus tells them, sit down in the grass. They're about to blow. Food or revolution. Now, one big miracle that fails to get mentioned here concerns Jesus and his disciples' skills at crowd control. I can't even imagine 13 people controlling a small urban riot in 2023. Jesus says to the crowd, analicthonai, 2 shades of meaning in Greek. Recline in festal mode for a party, or at ease but remain alert. The crowd does not analicthonai. It does not obey. Instead, the crowd does anapazon prazii. In farming, that meant in a garden bed divided. You've got your row for corn, your row for asparagus, your row for potatoes. It's divided. Later, it became a military term, meaning to line up in ranks and divisions. Anapazon prazii. Officers, strategists, special forces in front for a high-level conference, a briefing with the commander-in-chief. Privates, grunts, Sherpas, laborers, support families in the back. All are there for revolution, not food. They will carry the food they can and plunder the rest on the way to the battlefield. This miraculous feeding brings us into a different context, a different kingdom, a reviewing of precedents and priorities. Now, you remember Moses and his continual feeding of the children of Israel through manna in the wilderness. And don't forget the corn dole of the emperors of Rome, feeding the citizens but taxing them to death so that the elite could gorge on delicacies. Jesus is the instrument of God who feeds all of his people for free with the shared resources of 5 buns and 2 sardines. While food is a major theme here, this is about revolution. It's a troop muster. All are packed to march on the Roman settlements. They know that Arminius in Germany successfully wiped out 3 Roman legions, not that long before at the turn of the century. Maybe, just maybe this time. And Jesus orders them to sit down and relax and eat all their provisions for the journey, for the battle. He tells them to sit down in the grass. The mention of the grass is important because it means it's early spring. That means the harvest is not in yet. All the grains at home will die in the fields, with the farmers off to war. The citizens remaining at home will die of starvation. It's a lose-lose situation. There will be no calories to fuel the march, let alone a battle. Food, a revolution? Let's eat, party, and go home. The crowd's not united enough. Rome is too entrenched in this place to win any battle. Terrible atrocities will befall the Jewish religion and people if the sectarian attitude and the violence continue. And as Jesus so aptly stated to Pilate at his trial, my kingdom is not of this world. The kingdom of God, portrayed many times in the Bible as a great banquet. Multitudes, myriads, millions have personally broken bread with Jesus, and in the process, been filled overflowing in surprising new ways. Revolution, a temporary worldly solution, resolves nothing, does not build up, only breaks down. Food, breaking bread together, gives both physical and spiritual benefits. So Jesus continues to divert us daily from our destructive ambitions, inviting us to joyfully join in his miracle of peace and possibility and participation in a new kingdom. Food for thought. Amen.